In the quiet suburban town of Carlsville, Kentucky, no one could have predicted the horrific crime that would shake the community to its core. What appeared on the surface to be a typical, tight-knit family was soon revealed to be the setting for a dark and twisted tale of obsession and control. The players at the heart of this tragedy were Heather Cole, her son Daniel Cole, and his new wife, Emily Cole, formerly Emily Davis. However, one key figure would soon dominate their lives in ways no one saw coming: Daniel's mother, Martha Cole. Martha, a 58-year-old widow, was the epitome of a doting mother, or so it seemed. She had lost her husband to a heart attack 2 decades earlier, leaving her to raise Daniel alone. She was fiercely protective of him, clinging to the role of caretaker well into his adulthood. Friends and neighbors often remarked on her over-involvement in her son's life. Martha's fixation intensified when Daniel married Emily, a bright, young elementary school teacher with an infectious smile and kind-hearted nature. From the moment Emily entered the family, Martha's behavior began to shift. What once seemed like maternal concern slowly morphed into jealousy and possessiveness. She believed no one could care for Daniel the way she did. Martha resented Emily's influence in her son's life, a sentiment that grew over time into something far darker. Soon, Emily found herself constantly scrutinized, with Martha showing up at their house unannounced, calling Daniel multiple times a day and often making snide remarks about Emily's cooking, housekeeping, and even her choice in friends. As months passed, the tension in the Cole household grew unbearable. Emily confided in her friends, expressing how Martha's presence felt suffocating. Daniel, stuck between his wife and mother, tried to keep the peace, but his refusal to take a firm stand only added fuel to the fire. Martha's obsession with her son, masked as concern, was slowly unraveling, but no one yet knew just how far she was willing to go. Martha's behavior began to escalate in increasingly disturbing ways. She would show up at Daniel and Emily's home while they were out, rearranging furniture or leaving meals she knew her son liked, but always with a passive-aggressive note about Emily's inability to take care of him properly. It was clear she saw Emily as a threat, someone who had stolen her son away. In reality, Daniel was a grown man, a successful accountant, and happy with his new life. But to Martha, no one was good enough for her boy, and certainly not Emily. Emily's friends urged her to set boundaries, and Daniel tried talking to his mother, but each time Martha would play the victim, breaking into tears about how she only wanted to help. Daniel's empathy for his mother blinded him to the depths of her obsession. Emily, however, began to fear for her safety, though she kept these fears largely to herself. And she noticed things out of place in the house: small items missing, clothing disturbed whenever Martha visited. But it was as though Martha was trying to assert dominance over Emily's space. One day, Emily returned home to find her wedding dress, which she had lovingly preserved, shredded and scattered across the floor of the guest bedroom. The room had been locked, and only Martha had the spare key. The message was clear: Martha was not willing to let go of her son, and she wanted Emily out of the picture. Emily's anxiety mounted. She began documenting Martha's intrusions, snapping photos and writing down incidents, hoping to convince Daniel of the gravity of the situation. But Martha had grown skilled in manipulating her son, convincing him that Emily was overreacting. The tension between the couple was palpable, but they were not prepared for the violent turn the situation would soon take. What no one knew was that Martha had already begun planning her final, deadly move, driven by a toxic mix of envy, paranoia, and a possessiveness that had long since crossed the line into madness. By late autumn, the psychological strain was wearing heavily on Emily. The couple's once happy marriage had turned into a battleground, with Daniel stuck in the crossfire between his mother and his wife. Daniel, torn between his loyalty to both women, failed to recognize just how dangerous Martha had become. What had once been subtle manipulation was now overt and hostile behavior. Martha's obsession with controlling Daniel's life had reached a boiling point. On a chilly November evening, Emily discovered a chilling message scratched into the wall of their bedroom closet: "You don't belong here." Though subtle, it was enough to make Emily feel like she was being hunted in her own home. She pleaded with Daniel to take it seriously, but he dismissed it as a misunderstanding, another example of his mother's eccentricities. He was convinced that his mother was harmless, despite all the warning signs Emily presented. But Emily couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. She began locking the doors more frequently, avoiding being alone in the house. She even considered taking time off from her teaching job just to distance herself from the situation. Martha, on the other hand, became more erratic, often showing up at Emily's school to drop something off for Daniel, using it as an excuse to intimidate Emily in public spaces. It was a slow, psychological war of attrition designed to isolate and destabilize Emily. In mid-December, the situation reached its tipping point. Daniel and Emily had planned a weekend getaway to celebrate their anniversary, a trip meant to rekindle their strained relationship. On the night before they were set to leave, Emily returned home to find Martha waiting in their living room. There had been no knock on the door, no phone call. She had simply let herself in with the spare key she still held. Emily, frozen with a mixture of fear and anger, demanded that Martha leave immediately. Martha stood there, unmoved, staring at Emily with an intensity she had never seen before. "You've poisoned him against me," Martha whispered. "You're ruining my son's life." That was the moment Emily realized just how dangerous Martha had become. But before she could react, Martha stormed out, leaving behind an air of menace that lingered long after she was gone. Emily knew deep down that things would never be the same again. The walls were closing in and she was running out of time. By the time Daniel arrived home that evening, the tension in the house was suffocating. Emily told him about the confrontation with his mother, but Daniel, emotionally exhausted, dismissed it once again. He assured Emily that his mother was simply upset and would calm down. He promised to talk to Martha. By now, Emily was certain it would do no good. What Emily didn't know was that Martha had been planning something far more sinister than verbal intimidation. In her mind, she had convinced herself that Emily's removal was the only way to save her son. Over the following weeks, Martha's behavior grew increasingly methodical. She began researching poisons, reading online forums, and buying ingredients from various stores to avoid suspicion. Her hatred for Emily had metastasized into a deadly obsession, one that would not stop until Emily was out of the way for good. On Christmas Eve, the Coles had planned a family gathering at Daniel and Emily's home. It was meant to be a fresh start, a way to smooth over the tensions that had torn them apart for months. Martha, however, saw it as the perfect opportunity to set her deadly plan into motion. She offered to bring her famous homemade cranberry sauce, one of Daniel's childhood favorites. Unbeknownst to anyone, she had laced the batch meant for Emily with a lethalate, a plant, a poison historically known as wolfsbane. Her plan was simple and cruel. Emily would fall ill after the meal, and no one would suspect the kindly mother-in-law who had prepared the dish. The evening started with the usual holiday pleasantries, but underneath the festive facade, mind was racing. She watched Emily closely, waiting for her to take the first bite. Each smile, every laugh from Emily only fueled the burning rage inside Martha. When the moment finally came, as Emily served herself a spoonful of the cranberry sauce, Martha's heart pounded in her chest. She was on the verge of finally reclaiming her son. But fate would intervene in a way Martha hadn't anticipated. As Emily began to reach for her plate, Daniel, absent-mindedly chatting with his mother, picked up a spoonful of cranberry sauce and took a bite. Martha's eyes widened in horror as she realized the terrible mistake. In her desperation to rid her life of Emily, she had just poisoned her own son. So within minutes, Daniel clutched his chest and collapsed to the floor. Panic swept through the room. Emily rushed to his side, screaming for help, while Martha stood frozen, the weight of her actions sinking in. What was meant to be a murder had turned into a tragic accident. The poison intended for Emily had claimed Daniel instead, setting off a chain of events that would unravel Martha's darkest secret and lead to a revelation that no one could have foreseen. The chaos that followed Daniel's collapse was immediate and terrifying. Emily, frantic and terrified, called 911 as Daniel lay motionless on the floor, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Martha, in a state of shock, stood silent, watching her son's life slip away before her eyes. Her mind raced through a fog of disbelief, unable to process the gravity of her fatal mistake. For the plan that had taken months to orchestrate had gone horrifically wrong. Paramedics arrived within minutes, rushing Daniel to the hospital. Emily was by his side, clutching his hand, praying for a miracle. Meanwhile, Martha followed in her own car, her heart pounding with guilt and panic. As the hours dragged on, the waiting room at Carlsville General Hospital filled with tension. Emily called friends and family, while Martha sat alone, consumed by the weight of her actions. She had meant to remove Emily from Daniel's life, but instead she had taken her beloved son from herself. A doctor emerged with grim news. Daniel had suffered acute heart failure, and despite their best efforts, they couldn't save him. He was pronounced dead just after midnight on Christmas Eve, a cruel end to what should have been a joyful family gathering. Emily collapsed into tears, devastated by the loss of her husband. Martha, however, remained eerily composed from the shock of what she had done. Her son was gone, not because of Emily, but because of her own twisted obsession. The tragedy didn't end there. As part of standard protocol, Daniel's sudden death triggered an autopsy. Toxicology tests were conducted, and within days, the results came back. Daniel had been poisoned. Authorities immediately launched an investigation, and while the initial suspicion didn't fall on Martha, the cracks in her facade were beginning to show. Emily, devastated and overwhelmed with grief, had no reason to suspect foul play at first. She was consumed by the loss of her husband, trying to navigate the crushing weight of his sudden death. But Martha's increasingly erratic behavior in the days following Daniel's death raised red flags. She was unnaturally calm, her sorrow seeming forced, and she offered no comfort to Emily, who was drowning in her grief. The police interviewed everyone who attended the holiday gathering, including Martha, but it wasn't until they searched the Cole family home that they found the first real clue. In Martha's kitchen, hidden in the back of a cupboard, detectives discovered a vial of aconite, extract the same toxin that had been found in Daniel's body. It was clear that this wasn't an accidental poisoning. Someone had planned it. The discovery of the poison in Martha's possession was enough to shift the investigation into high gear. Investigators dug deeper into her past, her relationship with Daniel, and the strained dynamic between her and Emily. Interviews with friends and family painted a disturbing picture of Martha's increasing obsession with her son and her growing resentment toward Emily. The police now had a suspect, but they needed more to prove Martha's involvement in Daniel's death. As the weeks passed, Emily's grief turned to confusion. The more she learned about Daniel's death, the more unsettled she became. Why would someone poison him, and who could have wanted him dead? She began recalling the months of tension with Martha, the veiled threats, the way Martha had tried to undermine her at every turn. Emily had always thought Martha's obsession with Daniel was unhealthy, but now she began to wonder if it had gone far beyond that. Detectives interviewed Emily multiple times, and slowly, she began to piece together the horrifying possibility that Martha had intended to kill her. The poisoned cranberry sauce, Martha's strange behavior at the dinner, and the years of hostility all pointed to a chilling motive. Martha hadn't meant to kill Daniel, she had meant to kill Emily. With mounting evidence, the police brought Martha in for questioning. Under intense scrutiny, her carefully constructed facade began to crumble. At first, she denied everything, insisting that she had nothing to do with Daniel's death. But as investigators laid out the evidence, her toxic internet searches, the purchase of the aconite, and the testimony from Emily and others about her obsessive behavior, Martha broke down. In a tearful confession, she admitted that she had laced the cranberry sauce with Perringer, intending for Emily to eat it. Martha justified her actions by saying she believed Emily had taken Daniel away from her, that she had ruined their close bond and was destroying his life. In Martha's twisted mind, the only way to save her son was to eliminate Emily. She never intended for Daniel to die, but her obsession had led to an unimaginable tragedy. The confession sent shockwaves through the community. Martha Cole, once seen as a devoted mother, was now exposed as a cold-blooded killer, whose warped sense of love had driven her to commit murder. Emily, still reeling from the loss of her husband, was forced to confront the horrifying reality that she had been the target all along. The woman who had made her life a living nightmare had intended to take it from her altogether. Martha was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Her trial would become one of the most talked-about cases in the state, as the courtroom drama unfolded and the depths of her obsession were laid bare for all to see. As Martha faced justice, Emily was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, haunted by the knowledge that the woman she had feared for so long had been willing to go to deadly lengths to destroy her. The trial of Martha Cole began on a cold February morning, barely 2 months after Daniel's death. It gripped the small town of Carlsville and attracted media attention from across the state. To the outside world, it was a shocking tale of maternal obsession that spiraled into murder. But for those who knew the Cole family, it was a tragedy of unthinkable proportions, one that had shattered lives and exposed the darkest depths of human nature. The prosecution laid out its case with grim precision. They presented Martha's obsession with her son, the hostile relationship with Emily, and the lengths she went to maintain control over Daniel's life. A forensic toxicologist testified about the aconite found in Daniel's body, and detectives detailed their discovery of the vial of poison in Martha's kitchen. The most damning evidence came in the form of Martha's confession, in which she admitted to planning Emily's murder but mistakenly poisoning Daniel instead. That single admission weighed heavily on the jury. It was not a crime of passion but a calculated plan to remove Emily from her son's life permanently. The defense, however, tried to paint a different picture. They argued that Martha was not in her right mind, that her actions were the result of an unstable emotional state driven by grief and loneliness after losing her husband years earlier. They claimed that Martha had not intended to kill anyone, and what happened was a tragic accident, albeit one fueled by her misguided desire to protect her son. The defense attorney called upon a psychiatrist to testify that Martha was suffering from a severe form of stomatological grief and delusion, which clouded her judgment and led her to act irrationally. But the jury remained focused on the facts. It was clear that Martha had taken deliberate steps to purchase and use the poison, carefully planning how she would administer it to Emily without anyone knowing. And though she might have been emotionally fragile, the prosecution argued, she was fully aware of her actions and their consequences. Emily, the widow at the heart of this tragedy, sat quietly in the courtroom throughout the proceedings. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights and unending grief. The loss of Daniel weighed heavily on her, but the knowledge that she had been the intended victim made everything worse. She had barely survived a murder plot, and now she was being forced to relive it every day in court. When the prosecution called Emily to the stand, she spoke softly but with an unmistakable strength. She recounted the months of torment Martha had inflicted on her, how she had felt hunted and isolated in her own home. As Emily testified about the moment she realized Martha's true intentions, the courtroom fell silent. Her words were chilling, and they left no doubt in the minds of the jurors that Martha had planned to kill her. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. The deliberations were swift. The evidence was overwhelming, and within 2 days, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. For the courtroom was still as the verdict was read, and Martha Cole showed no emotion, her face a blank mask. The woman who had once been a doting mother now stood convicted of killing her own son in a twisted plot of revenge. Martha was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, described her actions as cold, calculated, and driven by an obsessive jealousy that destroyed not only her son's life but countless others. He acknowledged the tragedy of the situation, but made it clear that Martha's deliberate actions left no room for leniency. For Emily, the verdict brought a sense of closure but no real peace. She had lost the love of her life to a senseless act of violence, and while Martha would spend the rest of her life behind bars, it didn't change the fact that Daniel was gone. The media attention soon faded, but the scars left by the ordeal remained. Emily moved out of the home she had shared with Daniel, unable to bear the memories that haunted its walls. She eventually left Carlsville altogether, seeking a fresh start in a new town far from the place that had witnessed so much pain. Despite everything, she carried Daniel's memory with her, always thinking about how different their life could have been if Martha's obsession had not torn them apart. But Martha, now in her 60s, began her life behind bars. In prison, she became a shadow of her former self. The reality of her son's death weighed on her every day, a constant reminder of what she had done. Though she rarely spoke of the crime, it was clear that she understood the enormity of her actions. She had lost everything in her desperate attempt to hold on to Daniel, and now she would spend the rest of her life paying for it. The story of Martha Cole's obsession and the murder of her own son became a cautionary tale in Carlsville, a grim reminder of how far unchecked jealousy and possessiveness can go. Though the town eventually returned to its quiet normalcy, the memory of the crime lingered, a dark chapter in its history that would not soon be forgotten. For Emily, life went on, though it would never be the same. She would always carry the weight of what had happened, but she learned to live with it, finding solace in the small moments of happiness that came with time. Martha's obsession had shattered her world, but in the end it hadn't destroyed her spirit. Emily's move to a new town brought a sense of relief, but it didn't erase the pain. In the quiet streets of Ashfield, a small town 2 hours away from Carlsville, she hoped to find the peace she had been deprived of. She rented a modest one-bedroom apartment, started working at a new school, and tried to rebuild the pieces of her shattered life. But no matter how far she ran, the trauma of losing Daniel and narrowly escaping death haunted her. She joined a support group for widows, though few could relate to the horror she had endured. Talking about her grief helped in small doses, but Emily's real healing came from routine. She threw herself into her work as a teacher, finding comfort in the company of children whose innocent laughter contrasted starkly with the dark memories she carried. Her colleagues, unaware of her past, only knew her as the quiet and kind-hearted woman who never spoke of her personal life. But even in the new town, Emily couldn't completely escape the shadow of the crime. Occasionally, she would come across a news article or hear whispers about Martha Cole's notorious case. The trial had turned Martha into a symbol of twisted motherhood, a woman who had crossed the line between love and possession, and it was a story that fascinated true crime enthusiasts for years after the verdict. Emily avoided the news when she could, but there was no avoiding the dreams. At night, she would relive the moment she watched Daniel collapse on the floor, the taste of holiday cheer, replaced by the horror of his final moments. In her nightmares, it wasn't Daniel who fell, it was her, with Martha standing over her, victorious. Each time she would wake up in a cold sweat, grappling with the reality that it could have easily been her lying dead that night. Therapy helped, though progress was slow. Over time, Emily learned to confront her grief head-on, acknowledging that what had happened was beyond her control. The anger she harbored towards Martha slowly turned into pity, though it was a bitter pill to swallow. Martha, trapped by her own delusions, had lost everything, but Emily had to remind herself that this loss did not excuse the crime. As the months turned into years, Emily slowly began to move forward. She made new friends, took up painting as a hobby, and even adopted a rescue dog, hoping to fill the emptiness that Daniel's absence had left behind. The pain never completely faded, but it became more bearable, less overwhelming. She started to see glimmers of a future she could build for herself, one that didn't revolve around the tragedy she had survived. Still, every Christmas Eve, the memories returned. No matter how far she had come, that night would always be a scar etched into her life. She would light a candle for Daniel, saying a quiet prayer for the man she had loved and lost. It was her way of keeping his memory alive, even as she moved forward with her life. She had survived something unimaginable, but she had also learned that survival didn't mean forgetting. It meant carrying the weight of the past with the strength to keep going. Meanwhile, Martha Cole's life behind bars had taken a darker turn. After her conviction, she was sent to a maximum security prison, where she quickly became a pariah. Among the other inmates, she was known not just for the murder, but for the chilling nature of her crime, killing her own son out of a twisted obsession. Even in a place filled with criminals, her crime was seen as especially heinous. Martha kept to herself, avoiding the other inmates as much as possible. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was only to complain about trivial matters or to mutter to herself in her cell. The prison psychologist attempted to work with her, but Martha's mind remained trapped in the same delusion that had led her to murder. She still blamed Emily for everything, refusing to accept responsibility for Daniel's death. Years passed, and Martha's health began to decline. Her once sharp mind dulled with age, and she became physically frail, her body showing the signs of confinement and stress. In her final days, she was transferred to the prison's medical unit, where she spent most of her time alone, staring blankly at the walls. She never received visitors. Daniel was gone, and any extended family had long since cut ties with her. In her final moments, Martha remained fixated on her obsession. Prison staff reported that, even as she lay dying, she muttered Daniel's name under her breath. In her twisted reality, she still believed she had done what was necessary to save him. She died quietly, her passing barely noticed by the outside world. News of Martha's death reached Emily through a brief, impersonal letter from the prison administration. Emily stared at the letter for a long time, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. She had long since stopped thinking about Martha on a daily basis, but the news brought a finality to the story. The woman who had caused her so much pain was gone, but it didn't change the past. Emily didn't attend any service or memorial for Martha, and she didn't dwell on the news for long. Instead, she went for a long walk with her dog, reflecting on the life she had built in the years since the tragedy. For Martha's death marked the end of an era, a final closing of the chapter that had once consumed her. Still, in the years that followed, Emily continued to live quietly, finding solace in the simple pleasures of life. Though the scars of her past would always remain, she had learned to live with them. She had survived, she had mourned, and she had rebuilt, and in the end, that was enough. The dark tale of Martha Cole's obsession and its tragic consequences would live on in infamy, but for Emily, it was no longer the story that defined her life. Martha Cole's death brought a quiet end to the tragic story that had once consumed Emily's life. When Emily learned of her passing, she felt a weight lift, a final closure to the nightmare she had lived through. No longer haunted by the threat of Martha's obsessive control, Emily allowed herself to move forward, finally free of the shadow that had loomed over her for so long.